Let's take a bit of time to talk about the null value in SQL. Sometimes we don't know what to put in a field of a tuple, and so we want to put in some value that means we don't know or it's unknown. And null is the value that SQL gives us for that. Every data type can have null values in a field. So integers can be null, text can be null, and so on. The presence of null in the type system can complicate our queries a bit. So we have to think about how null interacts with where clause predicates. And we have to think about how null interacts with aggregation as well, like summation. So you can't avoid nulls. They come out of outer joins after all. So we're going to have to sort this out. Let's look at an example where we have a tuple with null in it. This is a sailor's tuple. We have Jack Sparrow as a sailor and his rating is null. And we have a query that looks for sailors whose rating is greater than 8. Is Jack Sparrow in the output of that query? Hold that thought. You can see that it's ambiguous. But we're going to have to come up with some decision because the output of this query is either going to have Jack Sparrow or not. It can't be ambiguous. As a general rule, let's look at expressions that contain null, expressions of the form variable, operator, null. Those, by definition, always evaluate to null. And the intuition is no matter what's on the left-hand side, the right-hand side is unknown, and so the truth of the expression is unknown. Okay, so you can test this out by running a query that has an expression like that in the select list. You say select rating equals null from sailors. For every sailor, it will compare that sailor's rating against null and return null. So you'll get a null output for every sailor, no matter what operator you choose here. Now, SQL does have a syntax to allow us to turn these null value tests into Boolean values. So we can say rating is null or rating is not null. And those will give us true or false each time. So when you want to compare a field to null, use is null or is not null. Do not use equals. We will have queries sometimes where the where clause is going to evaluate for some given row to null. And the rule in that case that SQL has decided is if the where clause evaluates to null, we treat it as false. We do not output the tuple where null. So, the first query on this slide obviously returns all the sailors. If you add to it, as in the second query here, an expression that compares a field to 8, rating greater than 8, this is the query we had before. For Jack Sparrow, rating is null, so we're saying null is greater than 8. That evaluates to null, and the rule is we therefore don't output Jack Sparrow's tuple from that query. Similarly, if it's rating less than or equal to 8, that's where null less than or equal to 8, which equals null. Therefore, again, we do not output the tuple for Jack Sparrow from that query. More generally, we can have Boolean combinations of expressions in a where clause, which could have nulls somewhere nested underneath and, or not. And so we need to expand our notion of and, or, and not to deal with three-valued logic: true, false, and null. So you can look at these truth tables and think abstractly about what you think should be in these green boxes, the boxes that haven't been filled in yet. For example, not of null. Well, if we don't know if null is true or false, if it were true, then not of true is false. If it were false, not of false is true. So not of null should be null because we don't know what the output of not of null is. Similarly, take and of true and null. True and false is false. True and true is true. Given that we don't know what null is, we don't know what true and null is either. So here's the full truth table for and, or, and not, and let's go through our example queries. Select star from sailors where rating is greater than 8 and true. Well, rating greater than 8 for Jack Sparrow is null, so that's null and true. Null and true is null. Therefore, Jack Sparrow would not be in the output of that query. Let's look at the second query. Select star from sailors where rating greater than 8 or true. Well, or true is always true, right? So if you look at the truth table, if you have anything or true, it's true. So it's okay that rating greater than 8 for Jack Sparrow evaluates to null, because null or true is true. Therefore, in that case, the Jack Sparrow tuple will go to the output, along with every other row in the table. And then finally, looking at the last row, select star from sailors where not rating greater than 8. Remember, rating greater than 8 for Jack Sparrow is null. Not of null is null. And where of null does not go to the output. So Jack Sparrow would not go to the output in the final query. So the general rule here is because null can take on either true or false, the Boolean logic needs to accommodate either value. And if both true and false lead to the same output, then that's the output. If they lead to differing outputs, then the output is null. Now, what about aggregation with null? Our first query here, select count star from sailors. Note that it doesn't examine the rating field, and so it doesn't actually care what the rating of a sailor is. So select count star from sailors will take into account that Jack Sparrow row and count it up. Every row is treated as an individual row and select count star. But if we say select count of rating from sailors, now we're going to look at Jack Sparrow's null value. And null values will be ignored in aggregation. That's the general rule. So Jack Sparrow's row will not be tallied in count of rating. Count of rating and count star will be different in the presence of nulls in the rating field. This makes more sense when you think about sum. Select sum of rating. Well, we can add up all the ratings, but we don't know what Jack Sparrow's is, so how would we add it up? We're just going to ignore it. Same with average. We won't include Jack Sparrow's rating in the average because we don't know what it is. We'll just ignore it. For any aggregate, whether it's sum or average or even count, we just ignore the column values that are null. But if we have an aggregate over rows, like count of star, then we will pay attention to that row, whether or not it's got null fields in any of its columns. So to summarize, X operator null is always null. Where of null on a row means that row does not go to the output. For the Boolean connectives of and, or, and not, there's the special Boolean truth tables that take into account whether the output of the comparison is got two possible values or only one. If it's got two possible values, the output is null. And then finally, aggregates will ignore null-valued column inputs, but remember that count of star will look at every row regardless of whether it's got nulls in it.